One of the things that I think we all want as artists is ultimately to get attention, to create impact with our art, to make people care about what we're doing. But this is something that we don't always fall into. It can be tricky to know how to give your art, especially when it might be more sophisticated and subtle and meaningful. How to give it real impact. I could give you a book such as Creative Illustration by Andrew Loomis, and this has a wealth of knowledge on how to create great pictures, how to think about illustration theory, composition, color theory, everything to do with how to entertain the eye. But it can be tricky to know how that actually applies to our work and also what you should work on first. So what I'm going to do in this video is actually give you a really simple framework and way to think about creating both the emotions and the feelings and all the things that are integral to your art, the things that are more subtle, and then how to think about overlaying these bigger ideas of impact, contrast, and just making a noise, getting attention. This is a tricky subject, but I personally found that these ideas really helped me to understand some of what was going on when I had to match my feeling and my style to sort of more commercially viable applications to make sure that my art had impact and got people's attention, but still stayed true to me and what I thought was important. As usual for a Drawing Codex video, this is going to be neither fast-paced nor heavily edited. This is just you and me. We're going to be talking about illustration theory and this really thorny subject of how do we get people to like our work? And I'm going to be showing you some examples in Photoshop and just talking about these things in detail. So hopefully that sounds interesting. Hopefully you'll join me. Let's jump in and get started. Alright, welcome to the Drawing Codex. My name is Tim McBurney. I've been a professional working artist for over 20 years, and on this channel, we're all about drawing cool stuff from our imagination, embracing the challenge of drawing, and mastering the craft of line and color illustration. Now, if you'd like to learn more about illustration and picture making, you can check out my free illustration mini workshop. It charts my journey going from an amateur to a professional, and I talk a lot about really important issues such as how to get more detail and polish in your work, how to plan your images, create thumbnails, and also a few thoughts on how to approach being a professional artist. As I said, it's free. The link will be in the description. Go check it out if that's something you're interested in. The reason I wanted to make this video is that I find a lot of us do get lost with this topic in the beginning. In the beginning, we often have our style, our personality. We have very subtle things about our work that we're trying to express. The vibe, the feeling, the mood. And I find often, even though people don't have the craft yet to express that, we often do have the kernel of that idea, this little kind of like ember of our future artistic self there. And this is very fragile. It's very tricky to figure out how to draw it out, how to build it, how to grow it over time. But it can actually be the thing that is one of your greatest assets over the long term as an artist, both in terms of being able to genuinely create stuff that is unique, but also if you find this, then it means you're kind of doing the art that you actually want. If you can kind of match these things, you're not doing someone else's art, someone else's ideas. And I guess the trick is that we have kind of figured out a lot of how getting attention works, how to make good art. If you look at something like Creative Illustration, as I mentioned, is just full of like great advice on how to think about building tonal patterns, color theory, color schemes, compositions, how to think about your process as an illustrator. And these are, again, tapping into what we've known about what attracts the eye and what entertains the eye. You know, we've codified a lot of these things for 500 years or longer, talking about rhythm and beauty and all of the things that you would find in the great artistic traditions of the humankind, right? Essentially. And this is something that probably predates all of that, right? It goes back to adornment and the way that we've been trying to get each other's attention for hundreds of thousands of years, maybe even more. Who knows? And we figured out a lot of stuff, right? As I said, you can get given this advice, but I find the real trick is we often have that little voice inside us and we're trying to build that up. And often what happens is when you get given this advice, again, good advice from sort of teachers and people who know what they're talking about, that can like overshadow your voice. Again, and it can be tricky to kind of navigate that journey essentially, where you're trying to take that voice and that thing you have to say and give it more impact and figure out kind of where you fit in that sort of giant tapestry of art out there. Some of us do need to create art that has massive impact, right? Old school Jack Kirby, like boom, pow, impact. You might want to create art for, sort of modern AAA video games, right? Loading screens, which are all animated and everything's contrasty. We're sort of turning all the dials up on like impact and like boom. Or you might want to have something that's very subtle, right? Something that is very kind of low volume, but still has a lot of meaning. And for the people who are interested in it, has a lot of impact on their lives. It can be really tricky to know in the beginning kind of how to navigate this and which bits of that seminal advice that has existed for potentially millennia, right? Going back to prehistory. How to take that and apply it to your work. I think this is one of the fundamental challenges, and I'm going to try and dive in and give you a really simple framework that I think helps to understand this issue. First, let's try and, map out some of this territory, make some of these ideas visual. We are, after all, artists, and I think that's important. And this will give us a bit of context and I guess just describe what I'm sort of talking about here. Now, when we think of like impact, or what I like to call making the eyes bleed, this is where often we are trying to create art, and our goal as artists is to make art that really just like grabs you, right? The idea is a book cover should grab you, right, by the scruff of the neck and kind of like pull you to the book stand, right, from across the room, right? It should jump out and like punch you in the face from across the room. That is the goal of a good cover, right? Is to make you just go funk, right? Do a double take, right? And there's something about it that visually just catches your eye. And there's a lot of techniques for this. A lot of it is just contrast, right? We're naturally attracted to contrast. So I've got some good examples of what we kind of, typically think of when it comes to impact is your sort of Jack Kirby, who, is an artist who created a lot of the Marvel universe that subsequently became the Marvel Cinematic Universe, right? And they use a lot of the same tricks, a lot of the same ideas, but this is often what we kind of think we need to do in order to get attention, is literally just make people punching each other and having fists kind of flying into the screen, having super bright colors, and just kind of engaging also in melodrama, right? These images aren't sophisticated, right? They are very simplistic. And again, people may disagree, but I think like that's the beauty of it, right? But you nevertheless have, I think, what often illustration theory is getting at, which is like, how do you just turn up all of the dials and make sure that when people look at your work, they can't look away, because there's just so much color, there's so much going on, there's so much action, there's so much dynamism, there's so much kinetic energy, right? Always kind of interesting to see, like how people kind of handle these things. And you can see, I guess, this type of art and this idea embodied in most modern entertainment design. Movies, movie posters, cinematography, AAA video games, loading screens, everything, right? As concept artists, often what we're trying to do is create a huge amount of visual impact. Now, it's more complicated than that because different things need different styles and different moods, and there's different ways to get all of that kind of impact happening. But this is often, I think, the challenge is in the beginning, we kind of look at this type of art and we're like, well, that's not me. So I guess I'm just not one of these artists who is going to get attention, right? I'm just not going to create a lot of impact, and I'm not going to have a very loud voice, right? And we kind of shy away from it if like this doesn't 100% fit where you want to go. And some other good examples of this, would be someone like Frazetta. Again, I often like sort of showing Frazetta's work because I think, again, he does a good job of mixing some of this high visual impact, but also with, a bit more sophistication, a bit more of a subtle message, right? And, this certainly had everything that you would need in terms of grabbing attention, selling books, right? Like really being visceral and I guess embodying everything that we know and think about getting attention and having good illustration theory and all of that stuff, right? Like this kind of works, right? But it is leaning into a lot of what you would sort of think of as, sex and violence, right? It has a lot of the lowest common denominator. And especially now, again, when this came out, it was a little bit different, but yeah, there is certainly an aspect here of like, let's turn up all of the dials when it comes to visual impact, But we also have like other examples of this. And I think this is where often we have a harder time really figuring out like which aspects of great illustration theory do we need to pay attention to. And this can be subtler and a lot more tricky to do well. So you have someone like Norman Rockwell, really, really well-regarded illustrator and artist, famous for creating a lot of the Saturday Evening Post sort of cover illustrations. And you can see that this is a much more sophisticated, subtle way of getting attention. But a Rockwell cover will still do its job, right? It is still going to get a lot of attention, but it does so in other ways. There is often a narrative, there's a story, there is a lot of visual impact, but there's not that same level of, sort of action or kinetic energy, right? There's, in fact, very rarely a lot of kinetic energy in most of his images. Again, not to say he couldn't, but this is often a matter of thinking about the style, the feeling that you have, right? And you can see that Frazetta, for instance, and Rockwell are both going to have a really good ability to capture your attention, to maintain it, to draw your eye through the page, but the feeling you get is very different. And it's often combining these that I think we have a real challenge with, because often the examples you get in a book, again, like sort of creative illustration, are going to sort of steer you towards very strong compositions. And it's sort of talking about every single way that you could potentially create contrast and vibrancy and draw the eye. And sometimes you want to use the right one to get the right message across. And I think we can see this embodied even more when we look at something like Beatrice Potter's The Tale of Peter Rabbit, right? Because this is something that, right, has none of the visual impact of our sort of Thor Love and Thunder poster, right? It's not dialing up the contrast, the drama. There's no sex, there's no violence, there's no nothing. I mean, there is quite a bit of danger and drama in the actual stories, right? But we're looking at a very different way of kind of organizing images and grabbing your attention and making you feel something. And I think it's just important to understand that like all of these are kind of using the tools of illustration, the tools of picture making, the tools of attention, of impact in very different ways. But when you combine a really interesting, I guess, subtle, low-key story, like something that you would get in a Peter Rabbit tale, which again, especially today, feels very antiquated and tame, it's important to look at the ways that the art is being used to create impact and vibrancy and to make you look and to make you pay attention. So, I've got another couple of examples here, but, if you kind of zoom out, right, like this old Peter Rabbit cover, like it still is very graphic, right? It still kind of does a pretty good job, right, of, being impactful. And these illustrations, through story and through simple illustration tactics like repetition of shapes, repetition of color, interesting use of texture, busy areas, right? Areas of rest. They are actually very good on an illustration theory level at kind of getting your attention, making you look. They're not going to make your eyes bleed, but they are really going to have a lot of impact on people. And when you combine the message and the style and the personality, and then you combine it with some of that illustration theory in just the right way, which again, as a beginner, is really tricky to navigate. It's important to understand that there's a lot of good options there to create art that is more subtle, to not have to lean into every sort of Instagram, social media need to kind of grab attention and make everyone's eyes bleed and scream at them, to create work that I guess has more impact because it is telling very consistently a subtle story really well. And if you think about the impact that something like Peter Rabbit has had on people, if you kind of read this as a kid or you read it to your kids, it has a very particular vibe, right? Again, very sort of antiquated sort of messaging and stuff like that. But, it has a nice sort of cozy feeling that is kind of hard to get anywhere else. And it's often that connection to the feelings that we have as artists that really draws people in. And I think often we sort of have lost these days with a lot of sort of illustration theory training, the ability to understand how to create a little bit more impact with a more sort of subtle message like this. And so this is where, again, I think it's important to look at the way that we can have different ways of creating art and different ways of applying this sort of basic theory. We don't all have to have art that looks the same, because it often comes back to what our message is. So, another example would be, someone like Waterhouse, right? Classic sort of painter back in the day, really pioneered a lot of, sort of unique looks, and has like a very specific feeling to his art. And these are obviously, traditional oil paintings, but, they still had to work in galleries. They still had to have some sort of functionality there. And again, you can see so much of the kind of classic illustration theory, like things like composition, and also using like a lot of provocative subjects, right? Sort of like naked people. That probably got attention back then. It gets attention on Instagram these days. There's a lot of things you can use that we'll talk about again in a minute to really sort of think about how to create more impact and sort of presence with your art that way. But also we can think of some really successful examples where you can see people take a much more low-key, really interesting message, right? Someone like Ponyo, Miyazaki's Ponyo, has if you watch the film, and a lot of Miyazaki's film, but I think Ponyo is one of the best examples of really just visually, like it does kind of almost make your eyes bleed, right? It is just this symphony of color and craziness and vibrancy and psychedelia. But it's very relaxing to watch, right? It's very sort of chill. It has this kind of really nice sort of pastel, sort of colored pencil background that works really nicely. And it has massive visual impact, right? The colors, the poster, the dynamism, if you kind of see this on the screen, is very, very visually enticing. So I guess the idea here is just to look at and understand the way that different people are going to be utilizing and applying illustration theory, and that there is a pathway, no matter what your message is, to create things that are really, really interesting, that will get attention, that will get impact, and again, will work in a commercial setting. So hopefully that gives you a visual idea, I guess, of what I'm getting at here, the different options that are out there. And if you tried to do this yourself, if you really tried to figure out, how do I get people to kind of pay attention to my art, right? Like it doesn't have the right level of vibrancy or impact, but maybe your feelings are that you don't need that much, right? You're not really after this kind of movie poster or this loading screen kind of modern video game style of art where like everything is contrasted. There's always sort of sex, violence, rock and roll. There's just a huge amount of sort of compositional, everything's kind of leading into the right sort of place. There's dynamic lines everywhere, right? Like not everyone is trying to create that type of art. How do we kind of figure out a good process to think about, no matter what our art is, kind of maybe some stages that we would go through, and just a good way to think about how to dial this in properly? So the metaphor that I like to use that underpins this framework is one of sound. I think it's easier to kind of see maybe what we're doing as visual artists when we kind of step away from specifically talking about our challenges and kind of just use a slightly different lens. So the way that I like to think about this is that when we're thinking about, I guess, creating that kind of style of art that is really ours, the thing that we're going to be known for that has a lot of impact, no matter what it is. It could be subtle, it could be visceral, whatever it is. We're really dealing with a couple of different things. And in the beginning, it's really a matter of defining and refining your signal. If we think about you putting your art out into the world, in the beginning, you put it up on Instagram, you put it up on Blue Sky, you put it up on X, you put it up wherever, you're trying to get attention, right? You're thinking about like, how do I get people to look at my work? You could be doing this in school, trying to get feedback, like whatever it is. We're often like looking for, what do people think? And we often know, right? We often have like a good understanding of whether our art is good enough, whether it has the right feeling, all these kind of things. But the signal is that kind of initial feeling, right? It is your style, your personality. It is the thing that you're really trying to say that is unique about your art. And I find that, often even in the beginning, we kind of have strong feelings about this. We often know a lot. And it's important to understand that that is something that takes a while to nurture. It's something that takes a while to kind of really figure out and build and kind of get clear. It's not just a matter of creating any sound. It's a matter of creating your sound, your signal, something that is unique to you. It doesn't have to be wholly original, but it has to be something that, again, you understand and is really connected to what you think is cool about art and the visual nature of the world and all of that stuff. This is often, again, what we think of as style or personality. We're really thinking about the vibe of our imagery, the emotion, the message. And you can see that going back, you could see that Norman Rockwell, Frank Frazetta, like Miyazaki, Beatrice Potter, right? These people all have something that's very personal that they're trying to say that's very distinct when you look at their work. The next thing, though, to think about is like, okay, if we can develop a signal, one of the problems you have in the beginning, and this is one of the problems I faced, and I'll go through, these are images that I've created, and I'll sort of share a little bit of how I guess we can visualize this through my journey after I've kind of given the basic framework here. When it comes to creating more sort of impact, it's really a matter of volume, right? You have that subtle signal, but often, again, it's a little bit low volume, right? It doesn't have the impact that it needs. We haven't really applied all of the color theory, the contrast theory. We haven't maybe thought enough about the tonal patterns, right? Like, should I have light before dark or dark in front of light, middle ground, foreground, background, 1, 2, 3 read, right? Warm, cool, all that stuff, right? And you're just trying to make like, okay, how do I increase the visual vibrancy? But do so while we still have that signal. So this is where I think it's important to understand that on the one hand, again, we're making signal, we're really trying to dial in and fine tune what we think is important. And then we're doing this other stuff, which is, as I've said, create more visual impact. You're trying to turn up the volume on your subtle little signal. And these are really separate and important things that I think are good to kind of keep separate. Often what happens is people just go for volume first, and there's a lot of traps there. I might make another follow-up video talking about some of the traps that people fall into here when we think about what gives volume, right? As we were looking at with Waterhouse, there's a lot of naked women there, right? Like, naked people create volume, right? It creates attention. It creates a visual impact. People will look at naked people, right? It doesn't matter. It's universal, right? It's been that way for ages. I don't think that's ever going to go away. We'll also look at contrast, interesting color schemes. Some color schemes are going to draw your eye. Some color schemes are going to make you feel harmonious. But, either way, you can create a really impactful, interesting, attention-grabbing color scheme. And the other things that will typically, get your attention are things like faces, right? Things like drama, narrative, story. These are things that you can see functioning very effectively on sort of TikTok, Instagram, and where we have our attention economy, essentially these days, where it's all a matter of like you grabbing someone's attention. Often if you have ever thought about doing sort of Instagram Reels or TikTok, it's all a matter of like in the first, half a second, hooking someone, right? With a story. A lot of marketing and images as well are a matter of like, what's that number one read, right? Like, can you really smash someone over the head with this? Get them to look at that primary read, and then we'll kind of tell the rest of the story. So much of the way that we get attention is a matter of narrative, story, drawing people in with some very, very simple idea, and then telling us little kind of story there. Again, that will always work. Just looking at people's faces, expressions will work. We've got a giant bit of our own brain that's just 100% dedicated to other people's faces. We love looking at faces, hearing people's expressions, talking about characters. So there's a lot of this stuff, right? Like violence, dynamism, kinetic energy. These are all things that are just going to grab people's attention. Strong compositions. And the problem is, like, if you kind of just use all of them, right? If you just kind of say, okay, I'm just going to use all of those things, what you tend to find is like, it's a bit much, right? Like it's kind of like you need contrast in all things, including contrast, right? You do need areas to breathe. You need a story to tell. There needs to be meaning behind your story. Otherwise, everyone's just Mr. Beast, right? We're just kind of getting attention and there's nothing really there behind it, right? It's just, that's the story, right? It's like, I got your attention. The end. There's no soul. There's nothing underneath there. And again, that's fine if that's your message, right? But I think for a lot of us, it's not. So often our goal is to think about what are the aspects and the dials that we can use to increase the volume of our art while still maintaining that signal. And what you kind of find is, like, again, if you know even a little bit about music, you can kind of know that, some music works well when it's really loud. And, if you have a really good amplification, if you've got a really good speaker setup, and you just play some nice classical music, maybe some nice vocal music, if it fills the room, right, and you're just surrounded by amazing sound and it's subtle, you'll kind of listen to it, right? We'll kind of tune into that. If, again, that mix of kind of the volume and the signal are kind of right. And that's often what we're after, right? Is to really think about the balance of these two things, your subtlety, your emotions, the vibe, the mood of your art, and which aspects of illustration theory or just attention theory are you going to use? Which ones do you need to use in order to create the right level of volume for your particular audience, right? Again, if you're creating posters that are going to go in a movie theater to attract someone to watch a movie, you're going to have to pull out every stop you've got, right? There's no rules, there's no nothing, right? It's just 100% about you trying to get attention. Now, often what happens after this that I think is really important, and the reason I've added this third sort of little column here, is the concept of presence. And that is that, like, yes, you can figure out what you want to do as an artist. You can figure out maybe how to give it more volume. But the thing that I guess will really build that audience or create the impact over the long term is to kind of really pay attention to what you're doing and what works. Because often as artists, we do find things that work and then we stop doing them. And this especially happens when people are getting attention, right? They kind of they don't really understand that what you're after is to maintain that sort of presence if you do want to have impact over a long term. And that often what we're looking for when it comes to people's art that we like is consistency. So this has a little bit less to do with finding your voice. This is more a matter of like maintaining that voice and understanding that that's one of the big things that will give you power. And probably over the years will allow like me to make a video like this and say, like, okay, who are some artists I know who have had a really large amount of impact and have like a huge body of work, and we can kind of all talk about and draw on those images, and I can kind of put a bunch of them together, and they're all going to have a very similar signal, a very similar level of volume. It's that sort of thing that over the long term will give your work even more impact. And it's often a little bit counterintuitive and antithetical to what we want to do as artists, which is experiment. So this often happens to musicians, right? Specifically, where the metaphor maybe tracks really well is like often we like someone's old work better, right? People often experiment. They figure out kind of what works with an audience, how to create that kind of personality. They figure out how to turn up the volume on it, right? Make it really enticing. And then they play it to an audience and it kind of works really well. And then they kind of get sick of it and they want to squirm out of it. And I think it's important to understand that when it comes to, if you're thinking about like success or these sort of aspects of like building an artistic career or having a style, a lot of it is about redoing that style, right? Like playing your classics as an artist and repeating those things. And that is often where you have a lot of success. So that's, again, just a rough framework to think about this, because hopefully it gives you some steps along the way. Now, we don't necessarily have to do these in a linear fashion, but it's just understanding that what you're trying to do is dial in like a really clear, pure signal that is something unique to you, and then figure out how you can turn the volume up on that as much as possible while maintaining your signal, while maintaining the authenticity of your art in the beginning. And that what will probably give you success over the long term is not just figuring that out once, but doing it again and again and again, and figuring out what are those through lines about your signal, about the volume that you create, that people really resonate with. And that's what often translates into that sort of longer term success. And most artists, I think, quite frankly, do get a little bit bored doing the same thing, but they kind of know that's the thing that's kind of really working for them. And that's often sort of what they put out. That's what they kind of have to do. And that's just kind of part of it, right? Again, for better or worse. So I'll give you a couple of examples here of kind of, I guess, like how this transition for me, right? If we sort of think about, I've got some different stages here. In the beginning, This is where I was really trying to find my voice or some sort of signal. And this just, I guess, chronicles whatever success you could sort of define me as having up to this point, which is that, I've managed to kind of get, like a fairly sort of regular, consistent artistic career going. And people kind of tend to know me for a particular type of style or a particular type of work. But that wasn't always the case. So in the beginning, I kind of had these images, I guess, embody some of what I really feel would be my signal back there. And you can see that there is some things like these were done in sort of, I think, 2001, 2002, so 23 years ago, like quite a while ago. And for every one of these, there was 99 other images that didn't turn out in any way as good as these, right? So these may look a little bit better because these were the things I'm picking where I was like, you know what? Like I found something in my art that really worked. I just need to do more of it, right? Like I found it, but it's often really challenging to do that. So I would do these images, and these are the ones that 5 years later I go back to and I'd be like, I kind of strayed away from this, like this was a lot closer to what I felt looked cool and really sort of said what I thought was interesting, and maybe had the unique kind of style that I was interested in. And you can see here, I've included this because this kind of shows two takes on this, where I kind of tried to color it in this way, which it is actually like a little bit closer to maybe the way this is colored. You can see I've tried to use some of this sort of actually probably inspired by, sort of Leyendecker or some kind of much more stylistic way of rendering. I've got these kind of like marks going everywhere that are sort of abstract in nature. I didn't feel like this one worked, right? Again, tuning in, finding that signal, really figuring out like what is it about this image that I created that kind of worked, right? And it can be so challenging to find that in the beginning, because often what we're trying to do as well is like create contrast, create volume. So for instance, again, when I created this image, I felt like this one turned out a lot better, right? It turned out a lot more, it didn't have the volume, right? And I was really challenged to figure out like how to give this more contrast, how to make it more impactful. I ended up going with this kind of more mushy, sort of painterly approach. I think this might actually have been done in Corel Painter. I'm not quite sure whether it was Painter or Photoshop, but yeah, getting that sort of more blended sort of look. And, I felt like, again, though, despite maybe it not being perfect in terms of volume, that it had some subtlety that kind of was interesting to me. And this is where, again, you have to figure this out for yourself. Where this is often a massive struggle in the beginning, and it was a massive struggle for me. You can see I had these stylistic affectations that I was playing with, a mix of painting and line work. So I felt like, again, I kind of found something there that was, very sort of unique to me. And, if I compared it to everyone else's work, it felt like it was a little bit different. And, there's colors I was liking, there's sort of a tonal range I was liking, designs, ways of representing anatomy, like all this kind of stuff. So I guess like when it came to creating more volume, what that was about was just figuring out like how to create more complicated illustrations, how to create covers and things that look, you can see, like for instance, the Pinocchio cover that I did here for my Pinocchio book, which written by David Chevelle based on Carlo Collodi's classic Pinocchio. It came out in 2014. This one was, it's not super high contrast, but what we did, again, similar to, I guess, how we would think about the Beatrix Potter or something like that, is that, you have other ways that you can give it impact. So we had a nice kind of gold foil version of the Pinocchio logo. It has a very sort of simple color scheme. And overall it kind of has, a fair amount of sort of visual impact, but not so much, right? Because again, it's a fun children's book style tale. But again, I figured out, I guess, how to like add more characters, add more illustrations, and still maintain some of that sort of feeling that I wanted. Same thing with comics, right? Mixing this idea of sort of painted backgrounds, some painted elements, comic books, and sort of, translating some of these stylistic things that I was trying to do into an actual sort of comic book. So again, the problem is though that often, even though I'd kind of figured out a lot of these things, I don't feel like I had the consistency there. And so what I kind of found out later, if we think about that idea of sort of building presence or really repeating and figuring out like what is unique, I think it was probably when I kind of started to create more kind of scenes more regularly and to try and create things that had a narrative story in them and to just kind of keep doing that, right? And you can see, if you kind of look at my ArtStation, you can see there's probably a point where like I kind of started doing that more and more, and I got more and more jobs doing that. And the more jobs I got doing that, the more people kind of knew like, oh, that's kind of what Tim does. Like Tim could do that for us if he wanted. And it wasn't really until, again, I kind of started telling the same kind of story and really figuring out what was unique about these, that I guess a lot of it came together for me. So that's just, I guess, an overview of this idea. This is a tricky topic to try and tackle. Let me know in the comments down below how this one kind of went over for you, whether this gives you a few ideas about how to create more volume with your particular style. I think that if you can handle this and figure it out over the long term, it's often these things that will really make the difference. And often I can see students get really derailed by chasing just volume, right? Just saying like, what are other people doing that really is kind of working and getting a lot of attention now? And they just kind of do that. And they forget that what we're trying to do here is build something unique, right? That actually has our own style, our personality. And that if you just kind of chase the trends without understanding what's going on, you often don't actually get to a good place. So a lot of this is really thinking about what is cool and unique about you, how to turn up the volume on it. And once you find that kind of good mix of like, again, your uniqueness and kind of the volume that you need, turning up everything you can, like whatever you can. Now, there's no rules, there's no right or wrong. It's just a matter of like how you can get attention and help to tell that message. Once you get that happening, figure out like what about it do other people appreciate? Because often for me, again, in the beginning, I'd be like, people like this image that I did, right? I'd put an image on ArtStation or somewhere else on the internet and I get heaps of likes on it for some reason. I'd be like, whoa, this is it. I figured it out, right? I figured out what to do. And I do it again and it's like, no, like that was the wrong thing, right? I kind of didn't really understand what people were really liking about it, right? And again, that stuff's ephemeral. You don't always have to chase likes and stuff. But again, this is often what we're, ultimately after, is to get more attention on our work, get more eyes on our work, get more people to understand what we have to say about the world. If you want to learn a little bit more about one of these aspects, one of these pillars of illustration theory, I think a good one is warm and cool. And this video talks all about it. So check that out now if you haven't already.